That afternoon, I was walking back to the office after lunch when I saw three men in navy suits standing around my desk. The glass walls reflected the cold light from my monitor, still on, and papers were scattered across the floor. One of them, wearing gloves, was checking my drawer. Another was photographing the screen. The third was flipping through my notebook. I stopped at the doorway, coffee still in my hand. They didn't even notice me until I asked what was going on. The oldest man turned around. His face was stern but not hostile. He said they were from internal audit, conducting a security compliance review. I asked why I hadn't received any notice. He glanced at the paper in his hand and said it was a special request from management. When I asked who had made the request, he hesitated for a moment, then read the name: Rachel Bloom. I heard every syllable clearly, like someone had just tapped the side of my cup. Rachel's desk was only a few seats away. When I looked through the glass, she was standing by the coffee station, chatting with a coworker, though her eyes kept drifting toward me. She didn't laugh, just pressed her lips together slightly, like someone savoring the results of a plan set in motion long ago. I took a slow breath, set the coffee down, and told the team they could continue. I'd cooperate fully. My heart wasn't racing, but a chill spread down my spine. Something had begun. I sat across from my desk and watched them move. The clicking of the camera, the sound of papers turning. Everything was too sharp, too deliberate. In my head, the last few days started piecing together like a puzzle. Monday's meeting, when Rachel questioned my data retention protocol. Yesterday afternoon, when she walked past my desk, glanced at my monitor, and smiled. That knowing, artificial smile. I remembered the times she half joked that the company needed someone more adaptable, someone who could handle risk better. I hadn't thought much of it then. Now I did. One of the auditors asked to check my computer. He browsed the folders, took notes, and asked a few questions about my project. I answered briefly, giving him everything he needed. As he nodded in thanks, I caught Rachel's reflection on the monitor, walking slowly past my desk again, her eyes landing on my screen. This time, she didn't hide it. I met her gaze without a word. Maybe that silence was what made her stop. I knew the procedure well. I used to be part of the cross-inspection team when I led data security. Surprise audits weren't uncommon, but they always had a trigger, a traceable cause. The odd thing was that audits like this usually targeted system anomalies, not individual employees, and certainly not me, someone known for following protocol to the letter. That's when it hit me. This wasn't random. Someone had planned it. The lead auditor looked up and asked if I had ever taken client data off the company server. I said no. Every access was logged and stored in the central system. He nodded, scribbled a few more lines, then turned back to his team. No one spoke after that. I heard the wall clock ticking, each second stretching the silence thinner. I didn't know what they were looking for, but my instincts told me it wasn't inside my computer. It was in someone else's mind. When they packed up and said they'd return later that afternoon to finalize the review, I stood up, thanked them, and stepped out. Rachel was by the coffee station, phone in hand, waiting. She looked up and said lightly, "I heard they're auditing your data cluster. Hope it's nothing serious." I looked her straight in the eye and said, "I hope so too." Then I walked away, leaving her in the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee. Outside the window, Seattle rain kept falling, long streaks of water sliding down the glass like unfinished lines of code. I leaned against the railing and stared at the wet parking lot below. It wasn't fear that made my hands tremble, but the realization that someone inside this company was willing to weaponize trust. And if they'd done that, I needed to be ready for what came next. I stood there for a few more seconds, listening to the rain tapping the glass, then returned to my desk. Everything looked the same, yet the room felt different. If you've ever been through it, you know, when someone invades your space, it's not just your belongings they disturb, but the quiet boundaries you built around yourself. I sat down, reopened my computer, and watched the code lines scroll, like nothing had happened. But I knew. After today, nothing would be normal again. If you're still listening, tell me where you are right now. Maybe you're driving, or sitting alone in your office the way I was that day. I'm always curious where stories like this find their way. And if you believe, like I do, that calm defiance can stand against calculated deceit, don't forget to follow, because what happened today was only the beginning. I met Rachel for the first time 2 years ago, during the new staff introduction meeting. She joined DataSage with an impressive reputation, having worked for a major tech company in California. When she walked into the room, Rachel carried a confident energy, a clear voice, a persuasive smile, and a presence that filled the space. She shook hands with everyone, remembered their names within minutes, and when it was my turn, her eyes lingered on me just a little longer. I still remember what she said that day, that she had read my report on user behavior analytics and was deeply impressed. I smiled and thanked her, never thinking that polite remark would be the start of something calculated. At first, Rachel came across as a driven and energetic coworker. She often stopped by my desk to ask about workflow details, to review a piece of code, or to discuss a test result. She said learning from someone better was the fastest way to grow. I didn't mind. In fact, I was glad someone showed genuine interest in the work I did. But a few months later, what I had taught her began appearing in meetings, not as notes of gratitude, but as if she had come up with everything herself. I realized it clearly during our first quarterly meeting. The project my team had spent 3 months developing was presented again, this time in Rachel's report with her name on the title. When our manager praised the thoroughness of the plan, she simply smiled, never mentioning the team that built it. I said nothing. I didn't want to make a scene. In this world, credit is always the first thing to fade when placed next to reputation. After that, everything began to shift. Rachel started showing up in meetings she wasn't invited to, saying she wanted to stay updated on progress. She began emailing our manager, CCing me, to comment on my reports, even when no one asked. Her feedback was often trivial, sometimes absurd, but enough to make me waste time clarifying. Each time, she'd laugh and say she only wanted to help make things perfect. I stayed quiet because I knew that silence bothered her more than any reaction. Once, in a short meeting, Rachel stood at the whiteboard presenting her idea to improve the customer data management system. When the manager asked what the proposal was based on, she quoted directly from an analysis I'd written the week before, almost word for word, just changing a few terms. I looked at her, but she didn't look back. After the meeting, she came to my desk, put a hand on my shoulder, and said I was her inspiration. I couldn't tell if it was flattery or mockery. Rachel had a gift for words. She knew how to make people believe she always understood what truly mattered. She joked at the right moments, praised the right people, and when it suited her, she could appear perfectly humble. I heard a few colleagues say she might replace me one day. I didn't care. I never worked for titles, only for the sense of purpose that came from solving hard problems. But for Rachel, that was never enough. She wanted more recognition, visibility, to be seen at the center of everything. I started noticing the change in her eyes whenever I was praised. Each time the manager gave me a new project, Rachel would smile, but there was something cold behind it. She began pointing out my small mistakes in meetings, sometimes real, sometimes exaggerated. She'd say I was talented, but too closed off, unwilling to share, not adaptable enough for the team. I knew she was setting something in motion, but I stayed silent. I've always believed the truth eventually speaks, as long as you don't rush to defend it. But it didn't stop there. Rachel became close with one of the newly appointed young directors. They often had lunch together, and just a few weeks later, she was assigned to the data security project I was leading. She joined as a support member, but I knew she was there to watch. In team meetings, she asked detailed questions about storage protocols, access rights, and data protection methods. At first, I thought she was genuinely curious, until I realized she was writing everything down, not to learn, but to keep records. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the team grew tense. A few coworkers told me Rachel had been asking about how I handled sensitive data, even requesting to review parts of my source code. She said she wanted to understand my approach to risk management. I knew she was collecting fragments, small pieces she could later use for something larger. I just didn't know when she'd make her move. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I glanced over at Rachel's desk. Her screen was still on, showing a spreadsheet packed with dense lines of data. I stepped closer, just enough to read the file name. Performance log Emily. There was nothing else to explain. She was collecting everything about me: login times, access frequency, every system change. I stood there for a few seconds, then walked away. I understood then that the game she had started would eventually reach the point where I'd have to answer. From that day on, I started paying closer attention to every small detail at work. I realized Rachel wasn't just collecting data passively, she was setting traps. One morning, she sent me a data set with the wrong format, but gave it the same name as the original file. By the time I caught it and fixed it, she had already taken a screenshot of the first version and saved it as evidence of an error in the review process. Another time, she deliberately changed the access permissions on a shared folder, blocking me from uploading data on schedule, then emailed the director asking why the timeline had slipped. Every move was calculated, as if she had been planning it for months. I didn't tell anyone. I knew that if I reacted, she would use it as proof that I was unstable or losing control. So I stayed silent, watched, memorized every detail, and more importantly, started preparing my own quiet way to respond. I wasn't planning revenge. I just wanted to create a way for the truth to speak without me having to raise my voice. Because in any company, the loudest person is rarely the one people believe. One afternoon, while reviewing system logs, an idea came to me. If Rachel could use data to prove I was wrong, why couldn't I use data to prove the opposite? Not by tracking anyone, but by recording the things no one else noticed. Small acts, words of thanks, moments of cooperation people often overlooked. It sounded naive at first, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I called it the kindness log. I created a separate table in the internal system. Each time someone said thank you, each time someone helped a teammate, I recorded it. Not full names, just enough to recognize them. A simple line. DC, stayed late to debug a script. AH, helped resolve a client ticket. Small actions, unnoticed by most, yet they shaped the air we worked in. I had no intention beyond staying grounded, but as the list grew, I realized I was building something more meaningful than I'd expected. After a few weeks, the data sheet grew longer. When I looked through it, I noticed something strange. Certain initials appeared again and again. People I saw every day, the ones who quietly kept things running. And then there were others, names that never showed up, not because they didn't work, but because they left no trace of kindness. Rachel was one of them. Not a single line carried her initials, not one act worth recording. I never meant for anyone to see the kindness log, but another thought began to form in my mind. If someone ever accused me of something I didn't do, I wouldn't need to defend myself. I'd let the data speak, the kind of data no one expects. Rachel must have sensed that I wasn't reacting the way she'd hoped. She began to push harder. During meetings, she slipped in questions designed to corner me, casually referencing errors only an insider would know. She'd pretend to ask about the processes I managed, making sure everyone else could hear. I answered slowly, precisely, leaving no gaps. She smiled, nodded, but her eyes couldn't hide the frustration. One late evening, I stayed in the office to finish the month-end report. As I stood to make coffee, I noticed Rachel was still there too. She was in the empty conference room, the light from her screen casting harsh shadows on her face, so different from her polished daytime charm. She was studying something intently, typing quickly, deleting, typing again. I slowed my steps, careful not to make a sound. The door was slightly ajar, enough for me to read the file name on her screen. Internal Report, Ethics and Compliance Review. She was writing an official report, and my name was in it. I left the office without a word. Outside, the streets were quiet, windows glowing faintly in the drizzle. I walked slowly, the same question looping in my head. What did she want? Reputation? Power? Or simply the satisfaction of watching someone else fall? Whatever it was, I knew she was close to making her final move, and if that was true, I had to be ready for mine. The next morning, I opened the kindness log again. I added a new line without any initials, just a sentence. Sometimes the absence of kindness tells the whole story. Then I saved it and shut the screen. The file stayed there, still and silent, waiting for the day the truth would finally be seen. In the weeks that followed, I kept expanding the kindness log quietly. What started as a small spreadsheet on my personal computer became a simple automated system I coded during lunch breaks. I programmed it to scan internal messages and emails for positive language, words of praise, gratitude, or acknowledgement. Each time the system detected something like that, it created a new entry with the sender, recipient, timestamp, and subject line. No one knew it existed except me. I didn't hide it, but I didn't advertise it either. I just wanted to see if kindness could be measured with data. Over time, I began to notice fascinating patterns. Some people in the company, though quiet, appeared frequently in the kindness log. Daniel from accounting, for example, showed up almost every day. He often sent small notes of thanks when someone finished a task early or helped him close payroll on time. Alicia from HR, too. She always mentioned her coworkers with genuine respect, always found a way to recognize their effort. Looking at those entries calmed me, not because it was work related, but because it reminded me that there was still good around me. In a place where everyone was chasing deadlines and targets, noticing a simple act of kindness felt more valuable than ever. Then I started to see another pattern. Teams with higher positive interaction rates performed better. They had fewer system errors and smoother workflows. Meanwhile, teams that rarely shared gratitude, where conversations were all commands and responses, tended to experience frequent breakdowns. I documented every observation, not with any specific goal, just to keep track. But deep down, I knew I was holding something more powerful than any productivity report could ever be. One afternoon, I was invited to a company wide meeting on improving workplace culture. While other team leads talked about boosting efficiency, I just listened. Rachel was there too, of course. She stood up and presented her plan to standardize internal controls and enhance access monitoring. Her tone was firm and professional, her gaze fixed on the executive table. When she spoke about potential risks in personal data management, I knew exactly who she was implying. After the meeting, she approached me, pretending to be friendly. She said the company needed people who were truly responsible with data, and that she hoped I would fully comply with the new protocols. I nodded and said I always did. She smiled and walked away, leaving behind the unmistakable feeling that she was about to make her move. That night, I stayed late at the office under the cold, fluorescent lights. I opened the kindness log and looked at the latest entries. Dozens of familiar names, people who made the workplace lighter, kinder. And then one name is missing completely: Rachel. Not once. No thank you. No acknowledgement. Nothing. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then scrolled down to the last empty line and typed a note. There are people who build connections, and there are people who measure them only to control. It wasn't meant as a message, just an honest observation. But as I looked at the words, a chill ran through me. The next day, something strange happened. Daniel stopped by my desk and said he'd noticed the atmosphere in the team had become more positive lately. He didn't know why, but people seemed lighter, more collaborative. Alicia said the same. I didn't respond, just smiled. Maybe because I knew the kindness log was quietly doing its work, reflecting how people treated one another. With each passing day, I felt calmer, less affected by Rachel's provocations. Whenever she tried to test me with her half-joking remarks, I replied evenly, as if her words couldn't touch me anymore. Maybe that composure was what irritated her most. One late afternoon, I saw her in the hallway speaking with the department director. When they noticed me, both paused for a moment. Then she smiled and greeted me softly, as if nothing had ever happened. I nodded, walked past them, and when I turned back, I caught her eyes. Not angry, but resolute, like someone who had already decided to see this through. That night, I couldn't sleep. I opened the kindness log again, scrolling through lines of quiet goodness, small, genuine traces of humanity. Surrounded by those numbers, I wondered if kindness could ever stand against calculation. I didn't have an answer, but I knew soon enough someone would force me to find one. It was a Monday morning when I set my bag down on my desk and saw three men in navy suits walk into the office. My heart sank instantly. I knew exactly who they were: internal audit. This time, they hadn't come by schedule, nor had they sent any prior notice. The entire room fell silent as they approached me, saying they needed to conduct a full review related to data security. I nodded, calm, and asked what kind of support they required from me. The lead auditor said I could step away from my desk while they performed the inspection. I stood aside, watching them open my computer, browse each folder, take screenshots, and jot down notes. I knew they would soon find the kindness log, since it was stored directly in the internal system, never hidden. Rachel arrived shortly after, feigning surprise at the sight of the audit. She spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear that she had just happened to walk by, then asked what was going on. One of the auditors escorted her out, but before the door closed, our eyes met. Hers showed no worry, only expectation. I sat down in the break area, took a sip of coffee, and couldn't taste a thing. The sound of typing, cameras clicking, and papers shuffling drifted from my desk. After a while, the lead auditor came over and said they'd found an automated system on my computer and wanted to know its purpose. I explained that it was a personal tool I had built, designed to collect positive communication data, words of thanks, encouragement, or teamwork, to observe collaboration patterns across teams. It had nothing to do with client data. He frowned, asked a few more technical questions. I answered clearly, providing the code, test reports, and everything transparently. They exchanged glances without saying a word. One of them returned to my computer and opened the kindness log file. The room grew strangely quiet. They read for a long time. Then one of them turned to me and asked what the list represented. I said each line recorded a positive action, a thank you, an act of support, a moment of teamwork, just a personal way to document good things. The man nodded and asked to make a copy for the investigation. I agreed immediately. When they printed a summary, I saw familiar names appearing on the page: Daniel, Alicia, the tech team members, even the security guards. They examined the list carefully, marking things, exchanging brief looks. One of them paused at the frequency column, where each person's appearance rate was shown. I followed his gaze and saw it. Among the high counts beside nearly every name, one field was entirely blank: Rachel Bloom. No entries, no thank yous, no acknowledgments, nothing. The atmosphere shifted. One of them looked at me and asked if I had intentionally excluded anyone from the system. I said no, not at all. The data was recorded automatically, based purely on the language used in internal messages. If someone didn't appear, it meant they'd never sent or received a positive communication. He stayed silent for a moment, then nodded. They continued reading, whispering to each other. I couldn't hear what they said, but it felt like what they'd found unsettled them. Finally, the lead auditor closed his folder and said they'd compile their report and share the results soon. Before leaving, he looked at me again, his expression softer than when he'd arrived. I returned a small nod, though inside I was conflicted. By afternoon, the office was unusually quiet. Word of the audit had already spread. I knew Rachel was waiting for a different outcome. She walked past my desk several times, pretending to look for something, but said nothing. Her confidence from the morning was gone. When the short end-of-day meeting began, the audit lead came in, spoke quietly with the director, and left. I couldn't hear what was said, but I saw Rachel watching him go, her hand tightening around her pen. I packed my things to leave and found her standing in the hallway, phone in hand. When I passed, she looked up, trying to sound casual. She said she hoped the audit hadn't been too stressful for me. I stopped, replied that everything was fine. She nodded, forced a thin smile, but her eyes still carried disbelief, as if she couldn't accept that her plan hadn't gone the way she intended. On my way home, light rain fell over the city, streetlights reflecting on the wet asphalt. I knew the audit wasn't the end. It only made Rachel realize that the very tool she tried to use against me might turn against her. And if I was right, she wasn't finished yet. I thought things would calm down after the audit, but only a week later, the air in the company began to shift again. Whispers started surfacing, in the hallways, at the cafe near the office, during small team huddles. At first, I ignored them, until Alicia stopped by my desk, looking uneasy. She said Rachel had been telling people that I'd been collecting employees' personal data without permission, that my kindness log was actually a behavioral tracking tool, a violation of privacy. I looked at Alicia and tried to smile, but something cold spread through me. She added that she didn't believe it, but some people seemed to. I thanked her for telling me the truth, then said nothing more. The rest of the day, I couldn't focus. One question kept looping in my mind. Why would Rachel go that far when everything had already been made clear? The answer came the very next morning. Rachel sent a long email to the entire department about the importance of adhering to personal data protection policies. She didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew what she was implying. She wrote that even well intentioned data collection could damage trust, and the company should reevaluate all unofficial systems involving internal information. The email was skillfully written, the tone measured, and persuasive enough to make anyone who didn't know the full story believe she was acting out of responsibility. That afternoon, as I walked through the cafeteria, a few people were whispering. They stopped when I got closer. I sat down, tried to eat a few bites, but everything tasted bitter. Rachel wasn't attacking me outright. She was planting doubt. No evidence, no direct accusation, just words vague enough to confuse. Later that day, Daniel came to see me. He said Rachel had asked if he ever felt watched, knowing I had a system that collected positive messages between colleagues. He told her no, that he trusted me completely, but warned that she was talking to others, even management. He looked worried. I thanked him and told him not to get involved. I didn't want anyone else pulled into this. That night, I stayed alone in the office. The room was quiet, the glow of my monitor reflecting off the glass walls. I opened the kindness log and stared at the hundreds of bright, steady lines of data, wondering if the good I'd tried to protect could withstand a rumor. I thought of Rachel's eyes in the hallway last week, the confidence gone, replaced by something deeper, more stubborn. Maybe she couldn't stand losing, or maybe she just needed someone to blame for her own failures. The next day, I noticed people acting differently. Some greeted me half-heartedly, others avoided eye contact. During the project update meeting, the director no longer sounded as relaxed as before. He asked more questions, scrutinized every detail. Rachel sat across the table, silent, but I could see satisfaction flicker in her eyes. That afternoon, she stopped by my desk, her tone almost casual. She said she'd heard I might be having trouble with emotional data collection. She suggested I should be more careful with what I create. I looked up, keeping my voice steady, and said I had nothing to hide. My system was transparent and never violated anyone's privacy. She smiled faintly and whispered just loud enough for me to hear that sometimes it isn't about being right or wrong, but about how people choose to see it. Then she walked away. That night, I stayed up late. I knew I was standing on the thin edge between truth and rumor. I could speak out, defend myself, but I also knew any defense now would sound like denial. Rachel was using her favorite tactic, turning my silence into proof against me. And if I kept quiet, her version of the story would soon become the truth everyone believed. I opened the kindness log once more and scrolled through the old entries. Then I added a new column. This time I started recording not just acts of kindness, but the spread of negativity, as if I wanted to capture both sides of human behavior in one place. When I finished, I sat still, watching the blinking cursor at the end of the line. I knew there was only one way left to break the cycle. I had to bring everything into the light before Rachel found a way to twist it first. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, before the morning light reached the row of glass buildings across the street. The air was quiet, but something heavy hung over the place. I sat down, turned on my computer, and watched the login screen flicker and fade. My reflection on the blank monitor looked pale from a sleepless night. I knew today was the day I'd have to make a choice. The rumors hadn't stopped. Rachel had found a way to twist the story again, convincing people that I'd built an emotional tracking system, that what I called positivity was actually a tool to measure and judge behavior. A few colleagues had started to treat me differently, not avoiding me, but not meeting me halfway either. I could feel it, the slow, quiet isolation of being doubted. Daniel stopped by mid-morning. He leaned in and asked softly if I was sure I wanted to stay silent forever. He said silence can be mistaken for admission, at least to those who don't understand. I didn't answer right away. He looked at me, worried, and added that sometimes the only way to protect the truth is to speak it before someone else twists it. I sat there, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, then nodded. He didn't say anything more, just tapped the back of my chair gently before walking away. That afternoon, I opened a new email and typed the subject line: Personal project, transparency, and consent. I wrote briefly, clearly, no justification, no blame. I explained that the kindness log was a personal tool designed to observe patterns of positive collaboration across teams. The data it collected was fully public within the internal system, never touching private information, and its only purpose was to highlight acts of appreciation and cooperation among colleagues. I added that if anyone felt uncomfortable being included, they could request to have their name removed at any time, no questions asked. Finally, I thanked everyone for their constant collaboration, for believing that a workplace is built not only by results, but by how we treat one another. I read the email once more. Every line was honest. There was no defense, only clarity. When I hit send, it felt like setting down a weight I had carried for far too long. The first reply came faster than I expected. Alicia wrote that she hadn't known I was doing this, but thought it was the most meaningful thing anyone had done for the company. Then came Daniel's message, short but sincere. Don't stop. We need this. More followed. Some people said they had once seen their own thank you messages reflected in the system and felt recognized for the first time. Others said the kindness log made them notice small, valuable actions they'd overlooked. By the end of the day, I had dozens of replies, messages of gratitude, support, even surprise. A few asked how they could create a version for their own teams. I read every email carefully, feeling something in me ease for the first time in weeks. The storm of rumors seemed to be fading, but one person never replied, Rachel. She didn't comment, didn't show up around me, didn't say a word. In the following days, she avoided me completely. I saw her in a few meetings, but she never looked my way. I wanted to believe that meant it was over, that her silence was surrender. I almost did until Daniel told me Rachel was preparing another report, this time not just about me, but about the entire internal data framework. That night, with only the dim office lights left on, I stayed at my desk once more, staring at the numbers and lines of code on my screen. I wasn't afraid anymore. I knew that whatever Rachel said, the data couldn't lie. Numbers don't take sides. They only reflect what's real. And when the truth finally surfaces, no one can hide behind words forever. I turned off the lights and stepped outside. The city was still alive, headlights gliding over rain-wet streets. I walked slowly, tired but calm. I might not control what comes next, but at least I had let the truth speak before someone else tried to silence it. 2 weeks after I sent the transparency email about the kindness log, the atmosphere in the company had changed completely. People talked more. Gratitude surfaced naturally in meetings, and someone even left handwritten notes to thank their teammates. I hadn't imagined something I built could ripple through the office like that. But the peace on the surface was only an illusion. Beneath it, I could feel tension gathering, quiet but sharp, like a current waiting to break. On Friday morning, I received an urgent meeting invite from the director. The subject line read, Internal Security and Cultural Review. All team leads were required to attend, including me and Rachel. I knew right then this was where everything would unfold. The conference room on the 14th floor was large and cold. On the screen at the front, the company logo glowed above the title, Data Ethics and Culture Review. Everyone sat around the table in silence, the air filled only with the hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustle of paper. The director opened with a brief statement. The purpose of this meeting, he said, was to clarify the recent concerns surrounding internal data collection and to review the impact of ongoing cultural initiatives. Then he turned to me and asked me to begin. I stood without notes, looking directly at the room. I explained why I had created the kindness log, that it began as a personal experiment to regain faith in my workplace after months of tension. I described how the system filtered positive interactions and emphasized that it never accessed private data. I spoke briefly, calmly, and stopped once I saw everyone understood. The director thanked me, then turned to Rachel. She rose, composed and steady, her voice soft but clear. She said she fully supported building a positive environment, but worried that the kindness log might unintentionally capture private information people hadn't agreed to share. She added that such data, if misused, could erode trust and even be exploited by someone with bad intentions. People nodded thoughtfully. Her words sounded reasonable, crafted to seem protective rather than vindictive. The director stayed silent for a moment, then gestured for the internal audit team to present their findings. The lead auditor stood, opened his laptop, and connected it to the display. Charts and summaries filled the screen, data drawn from the kindness log they had analyzed over the past weeks. Hundreds of entries compiled into clear statistics. More than 130 employees recognized over 18 months, 740 positive acts recorded. Gestures like offering help, resolving issues under pressure, staying late to assist a teammate, or simply saying thank you. Then the auditor switched to the next slide. A frequency chart appeared, showing how often each employee's name occurred. Most bars were tall and balanced across departments, but at the very bottom, one column stood blank. The name beside it read, Rachel Bloom. No one spoke for several seconds. The air seemed to slow. Rachel didn't move. The director tilted his head and asked the audit team to confirm that the data was accurate. They nodded. He waited another moment, then said quietly but firmly that sometimes numbers speak louder than people. Rachel tried to recover. She said that her absence from the data didn't prove anything. Not everyone expresses appreciation through messages or written notes, and she preferred to focus on results rather than social gestures. Her tone stayed controlled, but the edge in it was unmistakable. The director nodded thoughtfully, then asked if focusing on results had perhaps made her forget that working with people is part of the result. Rachel said nothing. The auditor continued. He reported that their review had found no privacy violations, no breaches of personal data, and that the kindness log had actually improved morale and productivity across multiple teams. Several departments had even started developing their own versions of the system, inspired by its effect. The director looked around the room and said the company had always encouraged innovation that built culture. But what mattered most was how people responded to others' success. His eyes rested briefly on Rachel. He didn't need to say more. Everyone understood. The meeting ended in silence. As people stood up, Rachel stayed seated for a long moment, staring at the dark screen ahead. I didn't see anger in her face, only a hollow kind of disbelief. Maybe she hadn't expected that the same data she meant to use against me would end up exposing her instead. That afternoon, the director called me into his office. He said the kindness log would be expanded company-wide as a pilot project and that I would lead it. He also mentioned Rachel would be reassigned to the technical division, where she could focus on individual work without participating in cross-team initiatives. His tone wasn't punitive, just measured, like he was restoring balance after a storm. When I left his office, I passed by the open workspace. Rachel was gathering a few files, her eyes fixed on the desk. I thought about saying something, but stopped myself. Some things don't need words. The data had already spoken for itself. I came back to my desk that Monday morning without the heaviness that used to follow me through the door. People greeted me with ease. A few stopped to ask how they could build a system like the kindness log. I showed them, step by step, holding nothing back. It didn't feel like mine anymore. It belonged to everyone now, a shared space where people learned to recognize each other's worth in the simplest form, kindness. A company-wide announcement arrived from the director later that week. DataSage would officially launch a program called Human Metrics, a project designed to record and encourage positive behavior in the workplace. I was named lead. When I read the message, I sat still for a long moment, not from pride, but from relief. Everything had gone farther than I ever intended. What started as a personal idea had become something real, something that mattered. Rachel still came to work, but on another floor, in the technical division. We rarely crossed paths. Occasionally, I'd see her in the elevator. Her face was calm, her eyes steady, not avoiding, but not seeking conversation either. We'd nod politely, like two people who once knew each other well but had outgrown the need for words. I didn't hate her. Maybe, in her place, cornered by comparison and expectation, I might have lost my balance too. One late evening, as I was about to shut down my computer, an email arrived. No signature, no introduction, just a plain subject line. I didn't need to guess who it was from. She wrote that she'd read the kindness log expansion report and seen the feedback from others. She said maybe I'd been right, that data really could reflect truth even when people refused to see it. At the end, she added one strange, simple sentence: "Thank you for letting me see myself in it." I didn't reply right away. I sat there, the monitor's light spreading faintly across the desk. Her words took me back to the first time I saw her, standing in that introduction meeting. Confident voice, unshakable presence. Now her tone was different, not echoing through a boardroom, but soft, almost like a confession. In the days that followed, I kept my old habit of staying late. I'd sit before the screen, open the kindness log, and scroll through those small, overlooked records of decency. I added new lines, not just thank yous and gestures of help, but signs of quiet change. Someone who'd never said thank you before now sends short notes after every meeting. Another who once worked in silence had started acknowledging others' efforts. All of it recorded, forming a pattern no algorithm could fake. Sometimes I thought the kindness log wasn't something I built at all. It was something that rebuilt me. I used to care only about doing things right, by the book, without error. I didn't realize that a workplace doesn't survive on discipline alone, but on the invisible threads between people. I had once seen Rachel as the enemy, but now I understood. She was a mirror, reflecting the weakness I hadn't wanted to face in myself. When Human Metrics officially launched, I was invited to speak at the internal conference. I told them that data can record many things, but it can never replace sincerity. I said the kindness log was never meant to measure people. It was created to remind us that kindness leaves a trace, even when no one is trying to prove it. The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Afterward, I returned to my desk and looked out the window. Outside, Seattle rain was falling softly. Here, rain never shouts. It drapes everything in a thin, gentle blur. I opened the kindness log and typed one last line for the day. Sometimes the quietest data tells the loudest truth. I saved it, closed my laptop, and stepped out of the office. On the way home, I thought about everything that had happened. Some battles aren't meant to be won. They only need to last long enough for the truth to find its way through. The kindness log began as a small act to keep myself from being swallowed by cynicism. But in the end, it became proof that kindness, when acknowledged, carries more power than any strategy ever could. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise or confrontation. Sometimes it comes through silent records, through the patience of someone who doesn't need to prove they were right. And maybe that's the only way to make good things last longer than the people who create them. I stopped at the building entrance and looked up. The Seattle sky was soft gray, the rain gone, leaving slow drops sliding down the glass, catching the faint yellow of streetlights. I took a deep breath of the city's damp, clean air and smiled. After everything, it wasn't justice that had won. It was calm. If you're still here, maybe you've witnessed quiet battles like this too. At work, in life, or somewhere inside yourself. Which moment in this story stayed with you the most? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe, as I do, that kindness, no matter how small, can transform an entire space, stay with me for the next stories. Stories where justice doesn't always come from power, but from doing the right thing at the right time. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss any journey where truth finds its light. Thank you for listening until the end.